Hey everyone, welcome to Smart Training 365. Today, my guest is Dr. Mark Kovacs. Dr. Mark is a performance specialist, researcher, coach, and speaker with years of experience working with the best athletes in the world. He's also the founder of the International Tennis Performance Association. Mark, great to have you here.
Well, thank you so much for the invite. Looking forward to our chat.
Can you please tell us a bit more about yourself, your playing background, and what sparked your passion for the science of sports performance? What did you feel was missing?
Yeah, no. So I started as a tennis player, played, international junior tournaments, played college in the US, won an NCAA title in doubles, played professionally for a short period, and had some shoulder problems. And that's what got me into the whole field of sports science, biomechanics, physiology. So I went into the research world and was in sweat and blood labs looking at the ways different types of training impacted performance, recovery, what happened to your blood biomarkers during different stresses. So that was the world I got into. And then quite early on in my research career, I had an opportunity to work with the US Tennis Association, heading up sports science, working in coaching and education. And, with my background in tennis, it made a lot of sense. So I was super fortunate to have that opportunity for many years to work full time with the best tennis coaches in the world and also the best players. So helping those players develop. And after that, ended up getting opportunities to work and direct the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. So this is where we worked with a lot of different sports in the NFL, in the NBA, in Major League Baseball, and also in international football, soccer. Worked with the Brazil national team leading up to the World Cup in Brazil. We tested all their players for hydration, heat, and really trying to help them have the best protocols in place before that World Cup. Then after that, was able to work in the NBA with the Cleveland Cavaliers, headed up sports science and health there for a few seasons. And obviously, the travel that goes on in the NBA is pretty extreme. You're traveling on the road, you're landing a lot of the time at 2 or 3 in the morning. Then you have a game that next day. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on from a sports science training standpoint, strength and conditioning, nutrition, hydration, medical, all those different areas. And then while this was all going on, we set up the International Tennis Performance Association about 15 years ago now. And really there was a need in the industry to educate folks that wanted to more appropriately train tennis athletes. So we have members in over 50 countries and they're different specialties. So we have physical therapists, strength coaches, athletic trainers, chiropractors, medical doctors. We have massage therapists that have gone through a lot of tennis coaches. And the goal here is education around how to best train tennis athletes and go through all the different areas that a traditional strength and conditioning certification would go through, but it's highly targeted to what tennis players may need. So strength training protocols, recovery protocols, nutrition, periodization, injury prevention, testing, all those types of things that are specific to tennis athletes. And it's all science-based. Hundreds of research studies are used in the educational materials. So that's the background of the International Tennis Performance Association.
That's an amazing background, and I'm sure that you're enjoying all these experience in different fields because it's a gold mine. You'll discover different things, right? And you're working with the best athletes in the world. That's something very special.
No, I think you make a great point. Like, a lot of people have different interests, and so do I. And I've learned so much from the other sports. And that's the best part about it is athletes are all different. How they train is different. And getting to see and look behind the curtain on how the best athletes in all these different sports train, what the coaching philosophies are among some of these best coaches is really interesting to see as well. And then comparing team sports with individual athletes is really different again.
When I took your course, the level 2, I loved it because everything that you talked about, I can see it in the course. I learned a lot, and I always like to learn more. Looking forward also to the level 3. We'll talk about that later. How important is resistance training and sport-specific training in today's tennis, whether for juniors or pro players? What could happen if a player doesn't lift weights consistently and their on-court hours and knowledge of the game surpass their physical ability?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's always the debate is how much resistance training in sports should be done. And we know from the research that being able to handle the high forces and high loads that we see in tennis and in sports in general, having a good resistance training program is vital, and it's vital for injury prevention. Obviously, we look at strength training and resistance training from two facets. One, we want to improve their performance. Can they run faster, jump higher, hit harder? That's obviously going to be improved with a good strength training. But arguably the bigger benefit for many of these athletes is the injury prevention side, is trying to make sure that they don't get injured, and if they do get injured, they actually have enough resiliency to come back faster. So the strength training aspect is so important, but it's the right type of strength training. I think that's where a lot of people mess it up. It's like any type of training. Training is so broad, you have to be specific with what we're talking about. And unfortunately, I see so many tennis players that come to me after they've been injured, after they've had a problem, and then you ask them what were they doing, and many times they either weren't doing anything, which happens quite a bit. They just played a lot of tennis, or they were doing a very generic sort of strength training program that overworked the muscles that they didn't need to overwork. For example, they did a lot of bench pressing, or they did a lot of overhead pressing, shoulder pressing, and they ended up having shoulder problems because their pulling muscles, their rowing muscles, their back muscles were underdeveloped. Their shoulder stabilizers were underdeveloped, and they were doing a program that was not appropriate for them or for the sport that they were playing. So resistance training is vital. There's a reason every good tennis player at the pro level does consistent resistance training. They obviously do it differently than, say, a football athlete or a baseball athlete or something like that, but they are doing structured programming. But again, you got to be careful, because like in every sport, there is great programming and then there's poor programming. So be careful with who you work with and making sure that you get good advice from people that are knowledgeable in the field.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% in everything you said there, because not any workout is the right workout. This is also what we do. We teach people like the exercise selection, which is something we're going to talk about. When it comes to sport-specific training, whether it's strength, power, explosivity, or tennis, what, in your opinion, qualifies an exercise to be included in a program? And what tools or criteria do you rely on to measure the efficiency or effectiveness of an exercise for a given athlete or performance goal?
Yeah, it's a great question, because choosing exercises is one of those hotly debated topics. You go to 10, strength coaches, physical therapists, and you're going to get slightly different opinions on good exercises, not so good exercises. So to me, I always say there isn't really a bad exercise. It doesn't exist. It's just maybe poorly applied with poor technique at the wrong time, with the wrong athlete, with the wrong volume. So there's a lot of factors that go into that, obviously. So I don't always look at it from good or bad exercises. It's much more about where does it fit in the program? Does the athlete benefit from that? Is the risk greater than the reward? Those are the factors you have to take into account. And how you do that is you first test the athlete. Where are they? Where are they strong? Where are they flexible? Where do they have limitations? Because if someone's let's say a lunge exercise, for example. Most people would say a lunge is a safe exercise, relatively speaking. Most sports should do it. Most athletes should do it. But what happens if the athlete's so quad developed that they are 3 or 4x stronger in their quads and their hamstrings, should you still add lunges to the workout? Probably not until their hamstring strength gets better. And that's an important factor. It's not about the exercise, it's about the body that the exercise is being done to, and where do they need the strength. And that's a huge, huge miss, I think, on a lot of people, especially if you're doing somewhat generic programs. Okay, this is a workout that you can do, and there's plenty of them out there that you can start with if you've never done anything. But you really want to personalize it, and you want to make sure that it's appropriate to you.
Right. At Smart Training 365, we have a system that we evaluate the efficiency of a resistance exercise, an exercise that meets 16 biomechanical factors, and these factors are based on physics, anatomy, and neurology. That exercise is considered the number one in terms of efficiency, injury prevention, and minimum wasted effort. At what age should a young competitive player start resistance training? What type of exercise would you recommend? Body weight, free weights, or machine? What do you recommend?
Yeah, when should a young athlete start to resistance train is an important question. And I have a very simple response to that. They should start as soon as they can comprehend instruction, meaning that they can actually listen, understand, and implement what the coach is trying to get them to do. That could be 6 years old, that could be 8 years old, that could be 10 years old. That's the defining factor. Can they take in instruction, and can they actually do the movement that the coach is trying to get them to do? Then you have to describe, after that, what is the activities that you're going to do at that age. And it's not about body weight or dumbbells or bands or machines. It's about resistance. What is the resistance that you're putting on the body? Because a body weight exercise can be heavier than a 5-pound dumbbell exercise. So if someone's doing a pull-up, if someone's doing a push-up, if someone's doing something like that, that's significantly more than 5 pounds of resistance. Whereas if you do dumbbells, you can actually do a much better progression and start light and progress slowly. Bands are great because you travel with them and you can use them easily, but bands can be heavier than dumbbells. Bands can be heavier than machines. It all depends on what resistance we're using with the bands. So I think the simple discussion of this is a good way to start, this is not a good way to start, is the wrong question. It has to do with, can the athlete understand instruction? That's number one. If they can't or they don't want to, then they shouldn't be doing it. If they can pass that barrier, then it's about starting very light, and could be body weight, could be bands, could be dumbbells. Most of the time, machines aren't the first starting point for you very young athletes. Reason being is machines aren't designed for young athletes. Nearly every machine that has been built, and I've worked with a lot of the big companies that build machines, they're built for a certain frame. They're built for an adult frame. They're not built for youth. So that's why I don't usually start young kids on machines, not because machines are worse or better. It's because they're not designed for youth athletes. So that's where it becomes really important, is starting appropriately and then progressing very gradually, especially at the young age. The goal of the young age isn't heavy strength. The goal is teaching technique, making sure that we're developing stability, making sure that they understand the movement patterns, and then very, very gradually building up. There's a reason why we don't need to go heavy at the young ages. One is joints haven't been fully developed, so that's important. Two is hormonal levels are very low, so the actual benefit of going very heavy is not seen until their testosterone and growth hormone levels really start to kick in, and that's usually just post peak height velocity. So that's where you've got to be also cautious, is when do we start to ramp up the heavy part of the heavy strength training. And I like lifting very heavy for a certain period of time with younger athletes, but it's usually later in their growth cycle after they've gone through their major growth spurt. So going beforehand, you're going to lift and you're still going to put load on, but it's going to be controlled. It's going to be under appropriate conditions, and it's going to be progressed gradually.
One of the 16 biomechanical factors is choosing the appropriate load and resistance. Because if you use, for example, as you mentioned, someone doing a pull-up, you don't give him the opportunity to select the right weight to do a full range of motion, right? And then start compensating, and that's how you cause injuries. So that's a great point. Mark, how would you work with a 14-year-old competitive player 4 weeks before a future tournament series as compared to 25 years old pro player?
Yeah, so 14 is a complicated age because one, you're using chronological age. You don't really know their biological age. You don't know where they are in their growth. So 14, some athletes have gone through their peak height velocity stage, which is their fastest growth period. Some athletes haven't. So if they haven't, your resistance is likely going to be less. If they've gone through it and they've close to finished or finished it, which on the female side is relatively common. On the male side, it's not. So you have to adapt based on that. So 14 is arguably one of the hardest age groups to work with because you've got a very divergent growth stage. Whereas a 25-year-old pro player, you know where they're at. They've gone through all their growth. Their joints, have fully developed. Their muscle growth ability is going to be consistent for the next handful of years. So you can lift very, very heavy if you want to. You may not want to, depending on what your goals are, but you have the ability to lift very heavy at that stage with comfort, knowing that as long as their technique is appropriate and they don't have major imbalances, which most tennis players do have major imbalances. But if you're 4 weeks out and you've got 4 weeks of training before the next tournament, you have about 3 weeks of really good work time where you can put pretty high volume on them. You can ramp up the intensity. And then as you get closer to the tournament, your volume's going to drop off court. So weight room work, movement work, stuff like that. And your on-court work is going to ramp up as you get closer to the tournament time. So it's this, format of, tennis-specific periodization. And 4-week blocks are pretty common. We work a lot in 4-week blocks because most tennis players have 2 to 3 weeks of heavy training, then they go and play 3 to 4 weeks of tournaments. That's a pretty typical model. So we know we're working in this 2 to 3 weeks of heavy training. And then once we get to tournaments, we prioritize certain tournaments more than others. And the training then has to be adjusted based on that.
Many worry about bulking up or getting stiff, thinking that resistance training might affect their range of motion and mobility. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so as long as you're going through a full range of motion, you're not gonna get stiffer. If you don't go through a full range of motion and you lift very heavy, you can. So it's all about what ranges of motion are you lifting in. And also, tennis players typically don't lift heavy enough historically to truly put on significant amount of muscle mass. There may be 1 or 2 times in their career where the environment is right for that. That's where their hormone levels are through the roof, typically, right after that peak height velocity. But for most tennis players, bulking up isn't really a major concern because most of the time they don't lift with enough volume heavy enough on a consistent basis to do it. And that's partly because they're going through they're playing a lot of tournaments. And most of the time during tournament weeks, you're not going to lift as much volume. You may lift heavy still, but you're not going to lift as much volume. So I'm very not concerned about that for most people. However, I have seen a couple pros that have worked with a new trainer who's come from another sport and has actually overdone the lifting, especially the upper body. And they got a really big chest because they were bench pressing a lot, which didn't make a lot of sense. The player got a lot worse. I mean, significantly. They got slower. They got a lot worse because they were lifting traditionally just heavy. They weren't doing any power training. They weren't doing any speed training. And just lifting heavy by itself doesn't transfer. Lifting heavy with speed training, with power training, transfers really, really well. But like everything else, if you only pick one variable, train that a lot, you overdevelop that and you underdevelop the other areas. So you do have to be careful with heavy strength training, but most people don't do it heavy enough for long enough to really get those traditional, say, bodybuilding type frames.
Right.
Because of the endurance also that you're having to do to play tennis. Tennis players are on court 3 to 5 hours a day. They're sweating thousands of calories every day. You know, they're exercising and, you know, burning so much that it's really, really hard to put on a lot of muscle in the way tennis players train.
Right. I was going to talk to you about injury prevention, but since you talked about transferability, let's talk about that first. So how can we accurately measure whether a strength or sport-specific exercise is truly transferring to better on-court performance? Is there a metric or a method you rely on to track the carryover between the gym and the court, like serve speed, reactive movement, or force output?
Yeah, it's the most important part, I think. And I've dealt with thousands of great strength coaches, personal trainers over the years that are so passionate about what they do that they forget their job isn't to make great weight room athletes. That's not their job. Their job is to make great tennis players, or if others, basketball athletes, baseball athletes. And sometimes people forget that. Just because they're doing great on your exercises doesn't mean they're getting better on the court always. So you have to be very careful that you don't forget that. And the things we need to get better at on the court are, like you said, serve speed. Serve speed's an easy one. Forehand and backhand speed. So that is measured with, you know, a speed gun of some sort. Very simple metrics to measure. Heart rate recovery during points is a huge one on the endurance side of things. So that's a really vital one. If you're saying, hey, we're doing endurance training and they're running better, their mile time is better, or whatever it is, if they're not recovering between points better, your training sucks. No, you know, it's not that there's no other way to say it. They may run their mile time better. They may do better on their treadmill sprints or whatever it is you're working on. But if they're not recovering better on court, your work to rest ratios that you've set up aren't transferring well. From a standpoint of movement, getting in and out of the corners is how tennis is played. From a movement standpoint, so lateral agility predominantly. If they're not able to get in and out of the corners faster, then they're not improving their movement. So it doesn't matter if you say, hey, our exercises in the gym are getting better, they're getting stronger, I'm happy with their progress. If they're not moving better on court, you're doing the wrong workout. The beauty about sports is it's a merit-based system. Are they moving better? Are they hitting the ball harder? Are they doing all these physical things better? You can measure that. You can see that. And if they're not, I don't care how good you think your program is, your program's not working. Not working for that athlete. And, you know, the truth only hurts when it should. But a lot of us that work in the weight room a lot and work on the physical training side of things need to do a better job of realizing that even though our metrics may be getting better sometimes in the weight room, if we're not seeing it in the important things on the court, then our program design's not appropriate. We need to change it and make it better.
It's important to make sure that you're always testing and checking the data, keeping up and see, like measuring, taking the, you know, the time and all those things on a like regular basis, practically, so you can compare.
And I'd also always, especially for folks, and many of them don't have a tennis background that work with tennis athletes, they're very good in the weight room. Speak to the tennis coaches. You know, the tennis coach that works with those players, they know the tennis stuff really well and they know what they're working on. Make sure you communicate with them a lot and ask questions. Watch practice every now and then if you can. Watch the player move, watch the player perform, and ask the coaches, what are you working on? What are the 3 or 4 things that you need them better at? And then work collaboratively to make a better overall tennis athlete.
Absolutely. To me, I believe the work and the success of a strength and conditioning coach is not alone. You have to be in constant track and contact with the tennis coach, with the physiotherapist, with the athletes, so you understand like what is he working on, what is the coach is trying to achieve, how is the player is recovering, so you can adjust and make sure that the program is really personalized and updated.
So true.
Yeah. What are some of the most common biomechanical inefficiencies you see in tennis players that could be addressed through smart resistance training? Are these more common with juniors or pros?
Yeah, so in tennis, you have a handful of injuries that come up all the time. So it's a greater risk when you play high level tennis. One is lower back stresses. So stress fractures in L5, S1, that area is the most common area. And you see it typically during the major growth periods in youth athletes. And a lot of the time that's due to poor technique on the ground strokes. They're locking their hips and they're over rotating their trunk, so they don't have good hip mobility and movement during their stroke. That's one. And then the big reason is due to the poor technique on the tennis serve. So what they're doing is they're loading their lower body, but they're over rotating early into the serve. And when they over rotate early, the only way you can make contact with the ball is to actually collapse your trunk. And when you collapse your trunk, you put these shear forces in the lower back. And that's the number one reason for lower back pain and really significant potential problems during those growth years. So with youth athletes, that's the number one thing I recommend trying to avoid, and making sure they fix their serve technique early. And when I say early, I'm talking 11, 12, 13, because most of the time we start seeing these problems between 13 and 17. That's sort of our red zone years for junior tennis players and lower back problems. So make sure you address the serve technique early. That's the number one most debilitating issue we see. Number two, we see a lot of shoulder and now elbow related issues. And most of the time, that's due to one, poor technique, but it's usually not only poor technique, especially in the young athlete. A lot of the time, it's due to very poor posture. And when we're talking about posture, we're talking about shoulder position. It's anterior shift of the shoulder. So with the way the shoulder joint is structured, when it rotates anteriorly, it puts a lot of extra stress. You'll hear the term impingement a lot. That's the number one reason for impingement. And strength training can actually make that worse if it's done incorrectly.
Right.
If you're doing a lot of pressing movements without a lot of rowing or pulling movements, that can make that position even worse. So you have to be very careful there. The other is internal shoulder rotation. So your rotator cuff muscles and the internal rotation aspect is restricted in most tennis players. And a little restriction is part of the adaptation of the sport. It's a protective mechanism. But when it gets a lot, and what we typically say is more than about a 10% difference between left and right side is significant. If you have that much of a discrepancy, you're setting yourself up for shoulder related problems, either in the short term, but definitely in the medium or longer term. So that's a huge area to work on. And then the other one in youth that becomes a bit of an issue is knee related pain. And that's usually growth related knee pain. Osgood-Schlatter's is one that we see a lot. We have patella tendonitis is another one. And most of the time, that's really debilitating because it's painful for the athlete, but it's usually not a long-term concern, meaning that if you deal with it and you lower the volume during those periods of discomfort, if you make sure that you do appropriate strength training, and for a lot of that, we do a lot of isometric work to try to get the tendon strength stronger in the knee. So you'll do a lot of isometric holds. You'll do a lot of eccentric loaded exercises with actually quite a heavy weight. It's in a small range of motion because it's targeting the knees. It's not actually targeting the muscles. It's more targeting the tendon. So that's an adjustment over the last decade that we actually have taken from sports like basketball that has spent a lot of time on knee protocols and things to focus on from an injury prevention.
Thank you, Mark. That was a great explanation. The internet was a little bit bad there, but I could hear what you were saying. Let's talk about the mental strength now. When you break a point down into its three phases, the initiation phase, the construction phase, and the finishing phase, how do you see stress impacting performance at each of those stages? Besides stress, what other key factors contribute to errors in the first, second shot as compared to the middle and the end of the point?
It can be movement related. If you're not in the right position, you can't effectively hit the ball as efficiently as you should be able to. So movement is always where I spend the most time, because there are some great tennis players with great technique that never win a lot because they don't move well enough at the higher levels. So movement is priority one. You've got to be in the right position to hit the ball. Then you've got to technically have the right mechanics, from a loading to a acceleration to a contact position with your strokes. But assuming that all of those are appropriate and are at a good level, why do people make errors in the first two shots versus later in a point? So the first two shots, we know that's the majority of where tennis is played. The vast majority, if you can hit two good ground strokes, you're at a much higher likelihood of winning the point. And so it's not, most points aren't very long, but the individuals that do well on those first two shots have a pattern usually that they use. They serve to a location, then they expect the ball to come back to one of two spots normally, and then their movement is more efficient because they're sort of cheating a little bit. They're moving into position even before the ball's coming because they understand the analytics. They know if I serve here, there's an 80% chance the ball's going to come back here. And I'm going to make sure that I'm in that position so that I can hit my best shot next. And that's strategy. I mean, that's all about understanding play. The best players throughout history always did this. You know, they didn't have as much analytics in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But if you watch the Rod Laver era and you watch that era of tennis player, they knew exactly what they were doing. When they served one spot, they were anticipating the ball to be here. And many times they actually did it better than the players today because they didn't have as many distractions and they worked on patterns of play more consistently than many of the players today. Partly because of the technique and the rackets and the lack of ability to hit shots from the wrong positions. So that's one of the most important aspects when you're trying to win points early. The individuals that typically win points late, 8 balls, 9 balls, 10 balls, normally they're the fittest athletes. They're the athletes that have the ability to get into more of their glycolytic pathways. So if we're talking about sports science and physiology, you know, the first 2 or 3 shots, you're in your ATP PC phase where you are predominantly not having to worry about buildup of lactate, the challenges with shifting energy systems. You're in that predominant ATP PC stage. Once you start getting into 8, 10, 12, 14 ball rallies, now we're into 20 to 30 seconds of work at a pretty high level. And now you are starting to see legs getting heavier. You're starting to see pH levels drop. So the acidic levels of the body are higher. Your ability to utilize energy shifts into more of a glycolytic pathway and having to get energy from there. And athletes that haven't trained well enough in that zone, they're the ones that you typically see struggle. They don't cover the court as well after the 8th, 9th shot. They start to slow down and they start to make more errors. And when they make more errors, coaches many times will blame the mental side. Oh, they're not mentally tough enough. That may be true, but many times, no, they're physically not well trained in that zone. They may be well trained. They may be training a lot of effort on the practice court, but their program design may be wrong. They may be working too much at a high intense level for too short a period of time, possibly, or they're working at a too lower level, let's say a 5-minute practice where they hit one ball for 5 minutes. That doesn't relate to playing a point in tennis. You spend too much time in that zone, you're not going to do very well if your glycolytic pathway needs to be prioritized. So understanding physiology and your work to rest structures of your practice can make a big difference. And some pros really do terrible at this because their coaches aren't necessarily well trained in physiology and in energy systems and in work to rest ratios. They may be great tennis coaches from a strategy standpoint, even a technical standpoint, but they don't even understand. And these could be players that played at a high level. They don't understand how to structure a training session.
I want to talk to you about periodization because if you say, for example, now that they need to work the movement, and so periodization is a bit tricky because some of the, for example, if you're working on endurance, but at the same time you want to work on strength, power, and hypertrophy, these are opposed mechanism. You know, one relies on anaerobic system. So let's say in a typical program you have like in a week, day one you do, for example, strength focused work. Day two, power focused, then hypertrophy, endurance, speed, and agility. My question is, when following a program that targets multiple quality like this in a single week, what should we realistically expect in terms of results? Are we aiming to maximize gains in each area, or is it more about maintenance with small incremental progress across all capacities?
Yeah, and so tennis is the hardest sport in the world to periodize for in traditional periodized models. So when I started, I worked in the NFL, did combine prep training for the NFL, did some stuff in track and field. Easy sports to periodize for. You would have blocks of training time, months at a time, where you would prioritize, hey, we want to add 10 pounds of muscle this month or 2 months. We're going to do a lot of heavy lifting, hardly any endurance, and we're going to get that done. Pretty easy to do. Like you said, in tennis, you don't have that luxury. Most people don't. At the junior levels, you could. Not many people do, but you actually could do true blocks of time. And I've had done that with players. We've had 2 months of no focus on endurance, just focus on strength and size because that athlete needed it. But that doesn't happen very often. Most of the time, you have 2 to 4 weeks of a training block, and then you're playing tournaments, which you need to train through as well. So in those models, that's how we do this tennis-specific periodization, where you will hit the majority of your focus areas each week, but you will still prioritize. Let's say if strength's a priority over the next 3 months, those strength workouts are going to be high volume. They're going to be maybe you do 2 of those a week, not only 1. But you're going to highlight those and you're going to emphasize those. Endurance may be a little less of a focus during those periods, but you still need some endurance because in 2 or 3 weeks, you're going to be playing a tournament. So if you don't do any endurance, you're going to get stronger, but you're going to last maybe a set and then the athlete's going to run out of gas. So you can't avoid any of those big areas of focus because they're going to need them in a tournament pretty soon. So you obviously aren't going to be able to max out any one of those variables because you're not doing those as the only priority, which is what would happen in a traditional periodized model. But you can still get, and we've got plenty of data where individuals will make significant gains in those areas throughout a training cycle. But how we've typically done it is we'll take 2 priorities. It could be strength and power. That's going to be the priority for the next month. So that is where we emphasize our work, even though we've still got our endurance day, we've still got our speed day, we've still got our mobility, which is incorporated throughout. But our strength and power is where we focus it. So our heaviest days, we put that first. So we do that when they're fresh. We emphasize the areas of interest when they're the freshest, and then over time, that becomes less of a priority as we start shifting into, let's say, tournament time, where speed will probably be a bigger area of focus, and we'll do a lot more quick movements, a lot more rest, trying to get the explosiveness up while they're playing tournaments.
Yeah, but even though like that's not the priority, for example, for hypertrophy, it should be still included in the program.
Correct. If you go months without a specific area of focus at all, you obviously will see a decrement in that area. And
Right,
with
right.
most tennis players, we can't go months and months with losing out on a certain quality. So that's the hard part because you don't have enough hours really to do it. You've got enough hours to train. You don't always have enough hours to recover the right way if you train the
Mm,
right way.
right.
That's why most heavy strength training programs, you train 3, maybe 4 days a week with a lot of rest. Whereas in tennis, you don't have the rest time. You're practicing every day. You're wearing out your body. And obviously, we know if you are focused on that, and that's a big priority, which is playing tennis, it's very difficult to give your body enough recovery time for
Right.
true gains on the strength and hypertrophy side.
Yeah, especially recovery is like that's the tough for a tennis player, full recovery, right?
It's true.
As a fellow Tunisian, I'd love to, I don't know if you know that I'm Tunisian, but I'm a Tunisian. I'd love to ask you about Ons Jabeur. It's uh, it's tough to watch her dealing with recurrent injuries, and from what I see, she sometimes seems to hold back on certain movements, especially lateral shots, maybe to avoid discomfort or conserve energy. In a recent interview, she mentioned trying different things with mixed results, but she's determined to keep going. I know we don't see everything happening behind the scenes, but from your experience working with top players, what advice would you give an athlete at this stage of their career to break through these physical and mental barriers? And do you think, for example, focusing on improving the quality of her serve, return of serve, and shortening point to 3 to 4 shots could be a strategy? I know that would also mean adjusting strength training for serve power, reaction time on returns, and dialing in nutrition to support it all. I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, no, obviously I'm a huge fan of Ons. I think she's got, I mean, she is so much fun to watch. She plays the game in such a way that is great for the fans. Her personality is great for the sport. It's really sad to see her struggling as much as she is. It's very clear that there's a lot of issues that she's dealing with, and it's impacting most of her game in different areas. I do hope that she can find some solutions to this. Again, like you said, I don't know the back of house, all the issues she's dealing with. I don't know what their training plans are. I don't know anything like that. But looking at it from the outside, the things that I would like to see happen is, like you said, one, we have to address the true cause, which I'm sure they're trying to address. If she can't move, she obviously is not moving as well as she used to. She needs to find a way to move better. And that's a combination of, diet, training plan, working on the recovery on the things that she can. So that would be a big one because if you can't get her moving better, you
Yeah.
can't really play this game at the highest levels, at the levels that she should be playing at, that we would all like to see her playing at. And if that's not fixable, you can obviously try to hit the ball a bit harder, serve bigger, hit winners off the first shot or two. But
Mm-hmm.
realistically, she's not going to beat the best players probably without the movement piece. She may not move perfectly, but I would love to see that being addressed first and foremost is figuring out every little thing you can do to fix that. And there's a lot of things out there that can be done to work on stuff. So I think that's priority one. And I'm sure they're trying to address that. But assuming that that doesn't get much better, then your only next option is, shorten points, hide the limited movement capability, and try to offset that with a much faster serve and a much bigger first 2 shots on the ground strokes, and or you would say serve volley. But the problem is if she's not having challenges moving, it's really hard to serve volley at the highest levels. So that's the challenge. But yeah, I mean, I would love to see how she can get back to one of the things is, just really trying to get in as good a shape physically as you can within the restrictions that you have. And every player at the highest level has restrictions. We don't always hear about it, but I can
Yes.
tell you with many of them, very few players walk on court without something going on physically. And they work around that really, really well. And that's in all sports. That's in the NBA, that's in baseball, that's in soccer. I work with a few girls on the US women's national team in soccer, and they're always dealing with stuff. So it's not uncommon. The problem in tennis is you're a single athlete by yourself on a court for 2 to 3 hours every match. You can't hide. You have to find ways to effectively play your best, even with some limitations.
You worked with Andy Roddick before, right?
No, so I played with Andy. I never actually
Oh,
coached or
you
trained
played.
Andy. Yeah, I played doubles with him for a while. We played the Junior US Open together, a few other tournaments. So that was my background with Andy.
Oh, okay, okay. Because I know that you do workshops about the serve, and in your opinion, seeing her serve, do you see like rooms for improving her serve?
Yeah, I mean, most definitely, there's an opportunity for her to hit the serve quite a bit harder. The way she uses her legs and loading has an opportunity for improvement. She can bring her arm action through a little faster, so that technically there are some things there. But then physically, and I don't know what she's working on, but there's some things you can do physically to speed up your hip drive and to speed up the arm action, which are the two main correlations with serve speed. If you can improve hip drive, and if you can improve arm action from stage 4 to stage 7 in the serve, those are the things that correlate with serve speed the most. So at the very least, that would be great if you worked on that significantly, because then you could add, 3 to 5 kilometers probably for her to her serve speed, which is significant. If you can add a significant amount of speed to the serve and you get 5 to 10 more free points every match, that may be the difference between winning and losing a lot of these matches.
Last thing, Tiafo versus Musetti and Tommy Paul versus Alcaraz. What are your predictions?
So I got to go with my guys. I'm saying they're both going to win. Francis is winning and Tommy's winning. I know Tommy said it publicly that he's dealing with some physical stuff right now and he's pushing through it. That's going to be probably the biggest challenge for him. Can he play 4 hours against the beast that is, Alcaraz? That's going to be the hardest part. But I've said this for a decade. Tommy's got the greatest work capacity of just about anyone on tour. Him, Cam Norrie, two of the fittest guys out there. And, Tommy's built to play on clay. He can win the French Open at some point. I don't know if it's this year, but I think he's got a shot at winning that tournament. Francis is playing awesome. I was texting with Francis yesterday, actually, and he's feeling great. Clay's a good surface for him. People don't always realize that. His game is built on a little extra time on his forehand, and Clay gives him that. And his strategy on getting around that inside out forehand to open up the court gives him that little extra time to do it. And he's playing consistently well. Would love to see him really go far. So yeah, I got to go with my guys. I think they're both underdogs in those matches if you were betting. But yeah, you got to stick with them.
For sure. No, it's going to be great games, great matches to watch. Mark, where people can follow you and read about your latest research, and also, are we going to have a level 3 in person? I'm looking forward to do that because I want to do it.
Yeah, so the International Tennis Performance Association, go to itpa-tennis.org. You can, see all the information on that. For our level 3 program, the Master Tennis Performance Specialist, we had one about 3 years ago in person.
Yeah.
We're probably going to have another one either later this year or early 26. So I'll let you know for sure. And then if you want to reach me, you can go to kovacsinstitute.com and find me there.
Perfect. It was a pleasure to talk to you in person. I love everything you do, and I'm following your research and your post on Instagram as well, because you have an Instagram account. So thank you very much. Any last message you want to say to?
No, just thanks for what you're doing, and keep up the great work and keep making athletes, making players. That's the fun part. We all get to do a great service to help others get better at their sport.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next video.